My major project is a cooking type game where the player is set objectives to go out into the world, or the levels in this case, and collect ingredients for a chef to produce high quality meals. The game starts out in a tutorial stage where the player learns all the different mechanics that are found throughout the game. To make the game feel more immersive, I have added dialogue to the NPC who gives out the objectives so that they interact with the player in a small way. I made the text roll out so the player can read it easier. They then get passed into the next level, where the player has to collect two different ingredients so that the chef can make shepherd's pie. Next, the player has to go and kill a wild boar so that the chef can make a roast. They will find the boar grazing in a nearby clearing, and they have to make use of their throwing spears to fell the beast and harvest its meat. Lastly, they are asked to fetch ingredients for fish and chips. The ingredients include peas, potatoes, a fish, and a lemon. The player has to kill and harvest the fish, then scale a rocky mountain to reach the lemon tree to get the final ingredient. They are then rewarded with a delicious meal and a victory of the game. With the assets that I created, I wanted to keep it as a low poly art style, mixed with some dynamic visual effects. It's a design that I admire fondly and enjoy in games that I play. I feel like they provide a more immersive experience, sometimes even more so than hyper-realistic art styles. Examples of such games are Astroneer and Minecraft. The assets being low poly meant I could create a lot of them, and place a lot of them in the scene. There's one scene which has over 5,000 individual assets. Some examples of the assets that I've created are trees, rocks, grass, and of course the various different foods that you'll cook with throughout the game, such as fish and chips, a pork roast, and the ingredients for these including fish, lemon, peas, a wild boar, and potatoes. I made two AI creatures for the player to interact with, a fish and a boar, as mentioned before. For the fish's model, I kept it basic as it is not the focus of the level for which it features. The boar, however, was done with more detail as it is the main feature of the level in which it resides. Lastly, the levels needed a distinct place where objectives would be issued and for the player to return to once the aforementioned objectives have been completed. This took the form of a wooden log cabin, which is large enough to be seen by the player from the majority of a single level. This asset is by far the largest one I have created for this project, and although it may be a bit too complex, I feel like it's a good asset. I wanted to blend a few different materials together to create a more believable environment through a layered blend space terrain. There are three different levels to the landscape: grass, rock, and dirt. I had to make two of these in Substance Painter, as a single block color would not go for the effect that I'm looking for. This blended landscape allowed me to much more efficiently create scenes and levels without the need to go back over the landscape and paint it over with individual materials and colors. I had two artificial intelligent animals in this project, a fish and a boar. Both have a similar AI system. Basically, whenever the animal isn't being hit with a weapon or projectile, it is set on a random roam function, which means the animal is moving around a predetermined area, changing directions at will after a random amount of time. When the animal is hit with a weapon, attack, or projectile, it is then set to runaway mode, where it moves much faster and will be much harder to hit. Once the animal is killed, the animal stops moving and can then and only then be harvested by the player for the ingredients. The projectile the player uses to kill and harvest the animals is a projectile spear, which is thrown out in front of the player to deal damage to the animals. The main mechanic of the game revolves around collecting the ingredients for the dishes. While it sounds like a simple process, it took me a while to sort out the coding, requiring lots of trial and error, both with the collectible blocks themselves and the functions they were meant to trigger. In terms of the physical assets used to represent the collectible ingredients, their form was important to both the mechanics and functionality of the gameplay, and to make the environment more believable, as they had to blend into the environment, but also stand out so that the player could see them and spot them. Once the player has collected all of the ingredients on their objective, they head back down to the log cabin and to the chef to finish the mission and to progress through the levels. I wanted visual effects to play a significant part in the atmosphere that the game provides. I used 3 major unique visual effects throughout this project. The first was water. I needed water for my level that involves catching a fish. I initially thought about cutting out this visual effect to save time, but soon realised that it was more worth the time investment, as it increased the atmosphere of the scene to have dynamic, moving water as opposed to a static model. I experimented with a wide array of values to determine the way that the water moves. I also needed for the water texture to be see-through, at least translucent, so that the player could see the fish swimming around in order to be caught, without needing the player to directly walk into and through the water level. This took some time, as Unreal Engine can be finicky. I later discovered that the same visual effect could be repurposed with a color change for another use as steam lines coming off the food. The second visual effect I implemented was to simulate grass being blown in the wind. This took a lot longer than creating the water, as it required me to make a completely new material. Up until that point, I had been using a solid color on my models, as that was all I needed. With the grass, however, I wanted to have a gradient going from a darker shade of green to a lighter shade as it reached the surface, which would require a lot more work. Whilst the wind effect wasn't necessary to give the level an atmosphere, I think it goes a long way in immersing the player. Lastly, I wanted to implement some sunbeams, often called God rays, into the scene, to make it a more believable environment. The feature uses ray tracing function of Unreal to allow for an extra layer of realism in the game. The feature changes the way a scene is lit, as light now interacts with the objects and assets within a scene. Here is the final level in full detail and full playthrough.